Hello, I am Joel McLeod,
I'm Roland Tanner.
and welcome to the 905er, Strong Mayors. Premier Doug Ford is bringing them to the City of Toronto as well as the City of Ottawa, whether they want it or not. There is also talk in the air of Hamilton City Council being another potential target for a strong mayor system. However, what is a strong mayor? Do we even want one? That is what Roland and I have been pondering since this was proposed without warning or without consultation last month. Now, to answer our questions and concerns, we've reached out to Andre Cote from the Toronto Metropolitan University. Andre is the head of the Secure and Responsible Tech Policy Program at TMU and runs a mission-driven consulting firm that has worked with numerous clients on urban policy issues, as well as higher education, technology, and public finance. Recent cities projects included a Canadian Urban Design Lab for the new Federal Housing Accelerator Fund, an evergreen strategic foresight project with the City of Calgary, and supporting the Sidewalk Lab's public consultations on behalf of Waterfront Toronto. Previously, he served as both political staff and nonpartisan public servant in the Government of Ontario, first as advisor to the Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Finance, and later as a senior advisor to the Deputy Premier and Minister for Treasury Board in Advanced Education and Skills. He worked and studied at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, including as manager at the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance. Needless to say, he knows a lot about this topic and is a lot smarter than Roland or myself. And he joins us today to talk about the Ford government's proposal and what the potential risks and consequences could be. Please enjoy. Let me welcome to the podcast Andre Cote from Toronto Metropolitan University. Thank you very much, Professor Cote, for coming on to discuss the topic of strong mayors with us today. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
My pleasure, and definitely not professor, just Andre, and nice to be with you.
Well, you're smart. You're smarter than us, and you're going to probably teach us something today. So I think technically that makes you professor. So, but thank you for nonetheless for coming on today. But let's just so all of our listeners kind of have a baseline understanding of how the system currently works. How much power does a mayor typically have, whether they are the mayor of Toronto, the mayor of Ottawa, or the mayor of Bowmanville? How much power would a mayor typically have?
Sure. So I mean, it varies a little bit across the country, but if you look at and even within Ontario, but we have what has typically been called a weak mayor system, or a strong council system. And so in this system, the mayor is typically elected at large. So, across the whole municipality versus councillors within their wards. But on council, the mayor is typically just one vote. So, they've been called sometimes the first amongst equals. And so really it's a system where, kind of in contrast to our parliamentary systems where you have a lot of sort of centralized executive authority in a prime minister, a premier, and a cabinet. At the local level, really the executive authority has typically been held by the legislative body, not to get into the poli-sci 101 weeds, but by council. Decision making is with council. Mayors do have, it's been described as having, the bully pulpit. So because of the profile you have of being the mayor, typically you're much better known by voters across the city. You have the ability to kind of push forth an agenda in a way that, that councillors or, council writ large might not. So you have influence that way, but in terms of your formal powers, less so. And there have been some changes in recent years to strengthen a little bit, but we can come back to that.
So when we're talking about a strong mayor platform, I mean, people think of might think of in the United States, we think of like the mayor of New York City or the mayor of a city like Chicago. Can you kind of like what would that entail? Because we're going to get into the weeds with Premier Ford's proposal, it's not quite what that would look like here in Ontario. Give me like what would a typical strong mayor on paper look like then?
Yeah, sure. And so I think New York and Chicago are often the examples that we look to, but and again in the US there's kind of a spectrum of what it looks like, but those two and a bunch of other typically larger cities So the mayor would typically act as like the CEO of the city. The mayor would have authority for preparing and advancing the city budget, even if often the budget would actually be voted on by council. The mayor would have often the power to appoint the chief administrative officer or the city manager, who runs the whole sort of administrative apparatus of the city. And often for supervising, hiring, and firing department heads and other sort of key positions. And in some cases, the mayor would have veto powers over council decisions. So I think those are typically the kind of the bigger elements.
And I guess there's a couple of things that I've kind of learned over the years, I guess, is that I mean you called it potentially a strong council system, and I've always felt it's to an extent a strong staff system, and that the kind of initiative for a lot of the initiative for policy directions doesn't come from the elected people per se. It can do, but they've got limited powers in that regard in most cities. But actually comes from the staff, and then it's the council that can vote yay or nay. But it's not like you have a cabinet that comes up with an agenda of legislation they want to get passed. It's just not how it works. So I mean, I guess it's so fundamentally different from the way we think of provincial or federal politics working, I mean, I guess the question I would put in at this point is before we get into the weeds of what's being proposed, what are the disadvantages, do you think, of the system that has existed, of this kind of weak mayor system? And question, I don't know if you know the answer to this. I haven't got a clue. It's like, why did we end up with this system in the first place? Is there any kind of logic behind it?
Well, I mean, to your initial point, I think there's a fair amount to it around, a fair amount of authority, I guess, resting on the administrative side with the kind of permanent city officials, the staff. I mean, I think there are a few sort of key dynamics in the Canadian or sort of Ontario municipal system. One is so there are no political parties. So only in a couple of cities in Canada is there the ability to have political parties, but here there isn't. And political parties, as we know from our provincial and federal, and from south of the border and elsewhere, like they play a really important role as kind of an organizing function, as sort of like a brand identity that voters, can be attracted to, in terms of obviously choosing leaders who become the sort of figureheads. But I think also in terms of setting policy agenda, parties typically have platforms. I know recently, but provincially, not always, but typically, parties have platforms that is kind of the agenda that they intend to put in place over the next few years. In the city context, where the parties don't exist, you'll have mayoral candidates who will sometimes have platforms, but sometimes there isn't that much to them. And then you essentially have a bunch of councillors who are they can have affiliations or sort of like political leanings. Some can be more progressive or more conservative or whatever, but without the ability to sort of organize under a common banner and platform, they're all kind of free agents to a certain extent. And
we've actually discussed before. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah,
just an interesting point that we've discussed before. That I a bit of background. I mean, I ran for council 4 years ago, and only after running for council did I learn the extent to which councillors, particularly in small cities Burlington was the city I ran in, there are only 7 councillors, including the mayor. You're not allowed to have more than a minority of councillors in the same room at the same time in any kind of private setting, because that could be construed as them kind of doing backroom deals or whatever. They can't. The extent to which they can even go out for a coffee together is surprisingly limited. Because of this kind of you can't be cooperating together attitude. Sorry, I thought I'd just jump in there and mention that because it's.
But I mean that's key too, right? You think about how federal, provincial governments make decisions behind cabinet doors, and then they figure out how they're going to go out and communicate them. Well, to your point, there are open meeting laws that dictate that you cannot be making decisions, behind doors like that in the municipal. So all these things make it tougher to shape a coherent agenda and sort of advance it that way. And in terms of the history, I mean, I think a lot of it just goes back to the fact that, if you go back 150 years when our sort of founding municipal legislation was put in place, municipalities weren't by and large cities. That they were little sort of outposts in a rural country or province, and their functions were very basic things. And so I think over the last 150 years, obviously cities have come to become these large, complex, super important places. And I think in many cases the kind of the governance side hasn't quite caught up with it, or it has, but in fits and starts.
So let's flash forward to today then. As most people have probably read by now, Premier Ford's government is talking about introducing a strong mayor system, which right now it's tentatively slated for Toronto and Ottawa, but we wanted to discuss on this one because there's also rumors of in the future expanding those powers to the city of Hamilton and possibly other cities at large. Now, my understanding is the proposal is basically a mayor would be able to veto a council's decision if it was relating to an issue that the government of the day said was a priority for a municipality to focus on. As well, the mayor would be able to appoint basically the key city staff, like the city manager, et cetera. They would be able to appoint it with free kind of from the current political happenings of city council. What's your take on the proposal as it stands right now?
Yeah, I mean, well, the interesting part is it went from being a proposal to basically being a reality in a very short period of time, right? They kind of, this was not discussed in any way during the election campaign, as far as I know. And afterwards, you started to hear rumblings about it. And then, they had a throne speech in early August. And the next day they tabled this legislation, what is it called? The Strong Mayors Building Homes Act. And I mean, to me, it to a large extent kind of cuts and pastes a lot of the elements in the American strong mayor system. I think that the veto power is an important piece that we could talk about. But it also has a lot of the other elements that we talked about before. So the mayor would have the power to now more directly sort of direct city employees in terms of doing work and developing policy, appointing the city manager and hiring and firing certain division heads, setting the org structure, appointing and kind of creating committees and appointing their chairs and co-chairs, et cetera, et cetera. Also, the budget piece, the mayor would have the ability to propose the budget, which would then be taken forth to council. So to me, it's really a lot of those elements that we see in cities like you mentioned, like in New York, south of the border. And as of last week, the government basically sort of pushed this legislation through to third reading with no amendments.
Yeah, I'm doing a hollow laugh there. I mean, I think the proposal. I mean, I should be asking questions and not throwing my opinions in. But I would have said a few months ago, before this came out, that I would personally have been in. I personally feel there are massive deficiencies in the current municipal system, and part of it is that weakness that was built in, like you say, because of the rural past that we've kind of come from. But we lost him. You still there? Sorry, I think you went dark for a couple of seconds there. But the lack of discussion obviously is the thing with this government that I find problematic, that this comes out of nowhere. Do you see any? I mean, my impression was just from the kind of the experience with Rob Ford as mayor of Toronto, that in Toronto certainly, and I think in Ottawa maybe as well, that they already have a stronger mayor system, if you like. Like they have a kind of, they've made arrangements to give the mayor of Toronto a much greater role in things than, say, the mayor of Oakville or Burlington would have. Is that correct?
Well, I think, there's been a bit of an evolution. Like, to your point, and we can come back to this, the way this is rolled out, to me is what's truly troubling and problematic about this. I think, there's an important debate to be had here about if this is the right direction or not for our big, complex cities. But I mean, just to take the Toronto example, just because it's the one that I'm most familiar with. Again, there's sort of a long historical tale to this. Like, After the amalgamation in 1998, you create this new sort of, mega city of Toronto. It was realized pretty soon after that, like, okay, the way, city governance worked maybe no longer works for a city of, whatever it was at that point, 2.5 million people. So we need to reconsider these things. And so the province did that on the one hand. In the early 2000s, the Liberal government that came in negotiated the City of Toronto Act. And part of it was sort of symbolic around just sort of recognizing the importance of the City of Toronto, and later through updating the Municipal Act for other cities and municipalities. After the heresy, you're sort of signaling, we're going to consult with you, you're sort of a legitimate player. But part of it was also about enhancing their powers in certain ways. And so in Toronto, with some of those new powers, council actually, after great deliberation, some, expert reports, blah, 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 but a consultative process.
Like the way it's supposed to work. Yeah.
Well, you'd hope.
Yeah.
But at that point, council said, okay, we're going to make some changes to strengthen the mayor, but we're not going to go full strong mayor. And so and at the time it was David Miller. And so they said, okay, the mayor can take on this sort of CEO role. The mayor can set the council agenda at the start of term to, back to your point, create a little more coherence about what the agenda is. The mayor could create an executive committee, which would have to meet in public, but could act as kind of like a cabinet light in terms of sort of triaging items before they go up to full council for decision. The mayor could step back from being speaker to council so that they could actually be like a participant. And they couldn't fully direct staff, but they could, like, for instance, set the terms of the budget process to staff. And so it's sort of like kind of a halfway set of steps. And there were a couple other things. But I think the decision at that point was, going full, parliamentary cabinet or full strong mayor seemed like a bit much.
I want to just touch upon the existing proposed legislation that this government's pushing through, and that I think to people it sounds like, wow, finally, they're going to get stuff done at City Hall, right? And so that's what it sounds like on paper to the layman, or just at first glance. Finally, it's the mayor's going to be able to push through stuff to get done and make our city better. Great, wonderful. But I look at him saying there's a real Trojan horse in this legislation, and that the veto power that a mayor has is tied to priorities that the provincial government lays out. Now, those, I imagine, with knowing this government, those priorities will have to do a lot with development, presumably some kind of housing agenda. I'm not sure what that is. We don't really seem to have a clear plan put forward yet. But what is there a danger in that basically, like, doesn't it make the mayor of Toronto and Ottawa, potentially other municipalities in the province, basically a stooge of whoever the premier is at any given time going forward?
Well, I know that's been a big sort of focal point, and to me, it's a big sort of unanswered question. Like, so they've sort of said, well, this veto can be applied where a council decision contravenes a provincial priority, whatever the precise language is. But it's like, so firstly, what are these provincial priorities? They've signaled that the housing thing will be one of them, but like, what else are they? How are they put in place? How are they communicated? Secondly, what's the threshold for deciding whether a provincial priority has been contravened by a council decision, and like, who decides? Thirdly, I feel like there's a big sort of and frankly puzzling political dynamic here to me also, where it's like, what makes the province believe these mayors are going to do their bidding for them? Like in Toronto, you just have kind of a fascinating one where you have Mayor Tory, who is right of center, progressive conservative, and yet I never understood that he ran against Doug Ford and beat him locally. So I never saw them necessarily as having a deep sort of kinship. Maybe I'm wrong there. And then you look at the other municipalities. Like Ottawa currently has a former Liberal cabinet minister mayor, and so he's stepping down. But in the fall election, there's another former Liberal cabinet minister mayor who's running, and my understanding is another of the strong candidates is like a serious progressive councillor. And so maybe I'm missing something, but it's like, you're going to have progressive mayors in a bunch of these cities.
Yeah.
Why would they fall in line? So I feel like there's a bunch there to unpack.
So my feeling, well, I think Joel's and my feeling both to an extent there was going back to, I feel like everything at the municipal level has been coloured to an extent over the last 20 years by the Places to Grow Act and what that introduced. And it's like the Places to Grow Act was, I'll say until my dying day, was a good act with good intentions. But part and parcel of that was basically the statement that the city can do what it likes, as long as it doesn't contravene what the province says the city should be doing. And you think, well, yeah, fine. Well, that makes obvious sense. That how can there be a problem with that? That's obviously the way it should work. How it works in practice is it makes everything to do with development, certainly in urban growth centres, appealable by developers or by whoever wants to appeal. And the upshot of that, it seems to me, and you can tell me if you think I'm right or whether I'm completely off base, the upshot of that to me seems that the major development decisions in most Ontario cities are now actually made by the Ontario Land Tribunal, because anything of any size gets appealed. Unless the city says yes, it's going to be appealed. That's just part of the costs of building a building in Ontario these days. And it seems to me that what we've got here is exactly the same principle. It's like, you can do what you like as long as it doesn't disagree with what we say you should be doing. Well, you're going to have an appeals body to decide whether it contravenes it or not, in which case anybody with money can appeal it, and it's the same process. You've basically uploaded the decision-making process to the province because they, yeah. Do you think that's an argument with merit?
Well, I mean, firstly on the development side, I very much agree, and it's like, the full disclosure, my wife is a property developer, and so we don't necessarily agree on everything, but I I hear about what's happening, and it's almost like going to the tribunal is like the de facto on,
yeah, absolutely.
And not to sort of throw shade at the city planning officials, because I think on the other hand that they're completely overwhelmed and they're kind of boxed in by this threat of the tribunal. But it's like that, you get the sense that they'll almost like run out the clock so that it has to head down that path, and that's kind of become the de facto.
Well, and the clock was cut in half as well, so the clock is a lot smaller than it used to be.
Well, it is, but I mean, has that changed anything? It doesn't appear to have.
No.
But I mean, here's my question: why do this? Why not just make those, just impose those changes on the development side? And the province just had this the Housing Affordability Task Force come out and essentially recommend a whole set of things that basically said, impose these changes, impose as of right zoning, to certain levels, impose the streamlining of urban design rules to speed things up, impose limits on public consultations, and make changes to expedite things at the tribunal, amongst other things. And so you can totally debate what impacts this would have on local democracy, on citizen participation, all these types of things. But if your goal was to get housing built, you had an expert panel make a bunch of those recommendations that, frankly, I think a lot of even somewhat progressive folks wouldn't entirely disagree with, right? Mm-hmm. Why not just do those things? Like, why do this totally backdoor thing where you're fundamentally changing this, and then you're pushing mayors who might not do your bidding anyways.
Well, I want to kind of expand on that note, because it seems to be a trend that this government has been rolling out with for the last I'm going to say since about March, when they declared COVID was over. That it's been okay. Let's catch up, because the fact is I believe the last estimate is 1.5 million units in the entire province to meet housing demand, and to help kind of curb the affordability rates that's plaguing a lot of municipalities. And the housing affordability task force came out, and a lot of the things that you presented were things I think people are like, okay, that's interesting. Let's see about that. How can that work? But rather than implement that, they kind of just took the stuff that was in favor for developers, and okay, the land tribunal has the final say on all things development in this province, And they said, "We'll keep that. That's core." But in terms of enforcing very density housing in neighborhoods and to allow different types of development to meet various housing needs, that hasn't been touched upon by this government. And it seems to be like it's a passing the buck almost to say, well, because that's the thing, is you'd have to have a debate and they have to go out and win over people and make that argument to the public. And this government doesn't seem to want to do that. It's rather like, well, let's just give it to the province or to the mayors. They'll carry the political ramifications of saying to people in Toronto, Ottawa, maybe Hamilton or London, perhaps. And that mayor now has to carry the burden of going to the people and saying, well, no, we need to have this level of development or this type of development in this neighborhood now, because we need to meet targets that are set by the province. And this seems to be, in my mind, it seems to be a passing of the buck rather than the province is saying flat out saying, no, this is the way it's got to be, folks. We need housing for people. We need affordable housing for people. We're done waiting for the municipalities to get their act together. We're taking charge and bearing the political cost of that decision. I'm rambling a bit. I apologize. Something I tend to do on the podcast.
I was just going to say, I think it's a good point. I mean, the genius, I think the unintended genius of the Places to Grow Act is that the people who take the heat for all the history of Burlington over the last 15 years is of the local government taking the heat for all the development that happens that is ordered by the province. The council has no choice but to, within a certain degree of, they can argue about all the number of floors all they like. Ultimately, the stuff is going to get built somewhere. And the kind of genius is that the province is getting off scot-free from this and not taking any heat, and the local government takes all the heat. So maybe I can't quite believe that Doug Ford is that Machiavellian. He would like to be Machiavellian. I don't think he is to think that far ahead. But it seems like that. I mean, maybe that would be how it works out. I don't know. What do you think, Andre?
Well, I mean, I think that but Places to Grow is was developed over years and years, is incredibly sort of detailed and whatnot, right? And so through that process, they land on the intensification targets, and then over time that has to be hardwired into official plans and blah blah blah, right? My big question is, so I think Joel, to your point, it's like very clearly this government has been on the side of developers, and that's fine, that's their prerogative, and you see it through the MZOs and through a range of other things, right? My big question is, how does this, if your goal is really to accelerate housing, how does this get you from A to B? That's what I can't quite piece together, because again, you're relying on these strong mayors to advance all these things, but this does nothing to make the core problems go, or the core barriers go away, right? Whether it's NIMBYism, whether it's the way municipalities set their official plans, whether it's the actual planning process, whether they have enough planners and engineers on staff, like all these things that are sort of below the surface, but that are the root causes. I don't see how this is some magic bullet to break through in all those areas. And so if you're the developers, sure, maybe you want this. Not to throw my wife under the bus, but I was asking her yesterday, have you heard about this? What do you think about this? And she sort of said, well, I mean, it could have an effect, but she made a lot of those points. She's like, it's a lot of these more, call them even administrative issues that they're running up against that's slowing down the process, and very unclear how this would solve for them.
Yeah, I mean, if you're really wanting to help development, I think you're absolutely right. This is not the way to get it. It's a splashy move that doesn't. I think it could have very negative long-term effects if it gives birth to that kind of just appeal, basically taking the OLT system and applying it to everything rather than just development. But it actually, yeah, it doesn't. I can't really see how it helps development that much. Why do you think part of me is wondering if Doug Ford is basically, this was sold to him by the Minister of Municipal Affairs or whatever, as look what happened to your brother. They took his powers away. Let's make sure that doesn't happen again. I'm wondering if it's that kind of personal, low-level kind of motivation. And also, why do you think the province, having done that? Again, we kind of thought it had problems, but the proposals that were in the I can't remember the name of it. The proposals came out just before the election for opening up single family home neighborhoods to up to 5 stories, I think, something like that. Why do you think that they're not touching that? That basically they've just thrown that whole thing in the bin.
Well, I don't really know, and they've taken some heat for that, and I wonder whether it comes back to your point, which is maybe their view is they'd rather download the heat for that, so they'd rather hope that the mayors will take these on, and it is possible that in the current system, mayors recognize that they wouldn't get some of these more significant housing reform or sort of development reform changes through their council. So maybe they've never surfaced them. Maybe they've never brought them forward. Maybe they've been, sort of keeping their powder dry. And maybe with these powers, suddenly they say, okay, well, now's the time to advance, a more aggressive reform agenda or whatever. So there is a chance, and there have been some backroom conversations and whatnot that have informed this. But I think that's one of the big questions for me as well. And
go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say the other part that I just find so puzzling about this, right, is this is a government that basically in its first move showed that its level of sort of respect and partnership for municipalities was going to be, to put it delicately, less than the previous government, right? Where they stepped up and immediately intervened in municipal elections back in 2018. And what seemed to be like the rationale, again, was somewhat unclear. It seemed to be, potentially even just sort of a vindictive play to sort of shrink the Toronto Council to, with the regional chair elections, put Patrick Brown back in his place, and I think Del Duca was going to run in York. So again, in this election, or immediately following this election, after no public discussion, they proposed this dramatic change to municipal governance. But the interesting thing is, for a government with that outlook, what this has the potential to do is create much stronger political adversaries in mayors, in the mayors of Toronto and the mayor of Ottawa, and wherever else they go. And so I find that really fascinating. Like, part of the reason previous proposals for GTA regional government basically didn't come forward, a big piece of it was this fear that, like in Greater London in the UK, you'd create this mayor for the GTA, and suddenly he'd be like a mini premier, and that would be like a big threat to Queen's Park. And so I find that part really interesting. Like,
on that note, just maybe to push back on that idea is, this isn't new. The strong mayor's proposal or legislation isn't kind of out of left field. This is something that's kind of been a growing trend over the previous term of this government's kind of municipal agenda, if you will. Yeah, I haven't really seen a cohesive, and it's something we've talked about in this podcast, we haven't seen a cohesive movement between the mayors of Ontario to kind of push back concretely against the eroding of their powers to Queen's Park. Let's take perfect example, this one, the strong mayor's proposal comes out. John Tory isn't, tiptoeing like, Jesus, this is dangerous legislation. We need to really think about this. He's arm around Doug Ford, buddy, this is all great and wonderful. I've yet to hear any mayor really come out and say, yeah, I don't like this legislation as it's being proposed. This is what I want. And then I was thinking recently at AMO, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, I did not see any criticism from any of the mayors or any of the councillors that went to that conference against this government's policies. Maybe you're seeing something, but I don't see that kind of adversarial, who's standing up for cities approach yet. I haven't seen it yet in this municipal election so far.
Well, so the mayor of Ottawa came out strongly against it. So Jim Watson. So, an interesting circumstance there, because he's not running again. And so, but his points were interesting. He said, I don't understand what we're solving for here. He said he has developed a very strong and sort of collaborative relationship with council. And I can't remember the exact number, but he said basically 90+% of the items that he tried to get through council, he had been able to get through council. And it was through the development of those relationships and kind of a consensual approach. So he said, what this is going to do is disempower councillors and diminish local democracy in certain ways. I'm paraphrasing, hopefully not missing it too badly. But so there was that opposition. He also said, which I think comes to this, like, to what extent do we expect mayors to actually do this? He said he thought the mayoral candidates in Ottawa should come out and say they're not going to, I guess, sort of fully take advantage of these, commit to not fully taking advantage of these powers, even if they have them. And so I'm not sure if they will, but he was at least one example of someone, making the kind of counterpoint.
And I guess he's in the position where he can. The only other, mayors who are willing to openly speak out against the province are pretty thin on the ground. Because I guess because they're there with the begging bowl always, right? It's the way the system works. And the non-partisan aspect of municipal politics seems to always be taken almost to an extreme, and that we know that many councillors and many mayors have backgrounds in parties. Andrea Horvath, obviously a perfect example at the moment. Marianne Mead Ward ran for the Liberals at one time. I think of 100 other ones. But the minute they take the municipal path, they're always friendly with the province, come what may. I guess maybe a good outcome of this might be that if you do create more independent mayors, that might be a good thing. But yeah, I certainly see how in those cities the councillors, it's not like a councillor is a strong position anyway, but yeah, even more sidelined. Whereas a situation like we have in Brampton, where Patrick Brown, I think the whole issue with Patrick Brown in Brampton has been that he came in kind of thinking, right, I'm premier of the city. I'm going to bring in my people to do things my way, and that's just not how cities are supposed to work. So you immediately get a huge amount of kickback from staff and councillors alike. I should really find a question mark to put at the end of this rambling comment.
Can I just raise one
please
point?
do, yeah.
Councillor roles might not necessarily be the most glamorous, and you see this sort of call it hierarchy in our politics, where it's like a lot of councillors feel like their opportunity is to graduate up to becoming a member of provincial parliament or a federal MP. But then you also see a lot of them, once they get there, my view at least, seem very disappointed with what they get in those
absolutely
roles.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's because as a councillor you actually have a significant degree of power in a way that you really don't in our highly centralized provincial and federal systems, right? If you're a backbench MP or MPP at Queen's Park or in Ottawa, unless you find your way into a ministerial role, in my view, you have significantly less influence on the ground on policy as a councillor would. And so maybe there's slightly more sort of perceived prestige with those other roles, but
you also have just, and I just speak here from experience, just having been, I was just a volunteer in provincial politics, and then having a crack at running for council, and the freedom to say what you want to say is phenomenal. It's like, oh wow, I'm the boss of this whole thing. I don't have to worry about what anybody else thinks. I can say what I like. This is, it's hugely different from provincial or federal politics. But yeah, the downside of that is you don't have much power to actually do anything. But
I just wanted you Roland, you mentioned Patrick Brown, and I wanted to jump back to that idea because I'm sure if you listen to podcasts, you'll know that Patrick Brown's embroiled in a scandal of basically nepotism. He appointed his buddies, regardless of qualifications, to key positions within Brampton City Council. That's the allegation, not proven, but that's what happened. To bring it back full circle, that's kind of what this strong mayor's proposal would do, is kind of make that legal. And so, basically, like I find it ironic, like Patrick Brown's in this scandal pseudo scandal in Brampton.
I don't think we should suggest that he did anything illegal, but yeah, I just want to.
Well, it's a political quagmire for him right now. He's getting heat for it. But if this legislation went through, this would entirely be above board. Like nothing wrong happened here. He's entirely within his power, and it just rests on there'd be nothing to say here. It is kind of what I'm taking away from it.
Well, there'd still be public scrutiny, right?
Right.
An example provincially was like when Premier Ford appointed the OPP commissioner, and
right.
Ties. I mean, and another interesting piece is there is a change in this legislation frankly, I'm not sure exactly what effect it would have, but to the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act to set some rules around disclosure and the various other aspects for these mayors. So I don't think that would go away, but I think to some extent you're right that suddenly this is just a power that they would have for some key city rules. And if you look in the U.S., like someone like Mayor Bloomberg went into New York and he brought a bunch of his sort of high-powered corporate folks in to take on key roles in the city as Parks Commissioner and as et cetera. And so a lot of that worked out really well. He brought in some really top talent, and but it gives them that power, which obviously can also cause issues if it's used in questionable ways, I guess.
It seems like a proposal ultimately that is going to be the archetype of the sort of law of unintended consequences, because they've so little thought about this that how it shakes down could be anybody's guess. And there may be some quite positive things, and there may be some very bad things. But one thing is for sure is that no one really knows, neither the province nor anybody else. I mean, it's such a... I mean, with the first point you made is that there's no consultation, no, even by the standards of the kind of PC conservative mindset, which tends not to be too keen on huge consultations. I mean, goodness me, I get the motivation for wanting to cut that short sometimes, but even by their standards, this is like back of the envelope stuff, and it might. I'm just sort of sitting here thinking that one of the biggest problems we have at municipal level is, how many times we said it in the last 2 weeks, Joel, name recognition, who's going to win? Well, who's got the person who's actually been heard of? Well, Andrea Horvath is more famous than Bob Bratina, is more famous than Keenan Loomis, just to pick the local example. That's probably how it will shake down, because name recognition. By making the mayors more celebrities, if you like. Even the mayors of Toronto and Ottawa are already somewhat celebrity-ish. That's the worst thing you can ever do as a premier. It's like, well, yeah, you are creating rivals here for yourself. Are you sure you know what you're doing? So it's going to be interesting, because it seems like such a ill thought out thing. And I guess it makes it's good for podcasts. That's all I can say.
I am just going to jump in, because I see we're coming up on our time limit. So I'm going to throw it open to you, Andre, for the final word and final thoughts, or what should people be paying attention to as this new project goes forward for the provincial government?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just leave off pretty much with what Roland just said, which is, I think if you would have asked me a decade ago, when I was sort of deep into a lot of this stuff, I was much more bullish on maintaining a lot of the key elements of the municipal model in the big cities.
Thank you for listening.
I just felt like there were aspects of it that were more democratic. I think like it looks messy, but driving consensus is what our politics should be about, right? The openness, a bunch of these factors, the stronger council, and you contrast it with our federal and provincial that's become this super highly centralized, leader-focused system where the members are typically highly disempowered, even including some of our cabinet ministers. And so you sort of say, this push to get to that municipal level, why would we necessarily want that? I think today, I'm a little more on the fence. I just feel like we're not necessarily seeing the levels of ambition from our cities and our councils, given kind of the huge changes our cities have in advance. But I think it also comes to Roland's point, which is like, it's tough to make a change that's this big and dramatic with so little thought, right? And again, if you go back to the mid 2000s when they were thinking through some more modest changes in Toronto and also reforms to the Municipal Act, whatever, it was a whole process, right? And here it's just like, damn, we're going to slam through this legislation and this will be, in place as of November, and off we go. So I think it could have good outcomes. It's more just kind of hating the way this is going down.
Well, I think we'll leave it at that for this week. So thank you very much, Andre, for coming on and giving us your expertise, your insight, and your thoughts on this matter. It's going to be an interesting 4 years throughout the province. So thank you very much for taking the time to come on.
Totally, my pleasure. Great to be here with you guys.
Thanks.
You looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.